think the MacBook Pro late 2021 is still worth buying in 2023, and here's why. This is the first generation of the redesigned model, but so far, there haven't been any major issues with this redesign. The aluminum design beats most Windows laptops, which have a cheap plastic enclosure that can fall apart easily. This design is much better than the 2016 through 2019 design, which got chips and scratches along the edges extremely easily. This was also the MacBook generation to add back MagSafe, which was gone from the Touch Bar generation MacBooks. The 16-inch version of the 2021 MacBook Pros shipped with a 140-watt power adapter from the factory, but I've rarely seen the computer charge with 140 watts of power. There was an SD card slot and an HDMI port added in this generation of MacBook Pro alongside the MagSafe port, and there was one Thunderbolt port removed compared to the last generation 15 and 16-inch MacBook Pros. I have never used the SD card slot, but I do use all three USB-C ports pretty frequently. I do wish Apple included 4 though because of that. I rarely use the HDMI port since I've had a J5 Create dock, and I recently got an Apple Studio display, so I haven't gotten a lot of use out of that HDMI port in general. I have my Mac docked most of the time I use it anyway. The M1 Pro and M1 Max are very powerful processors made by Apple. Even though M2 is out, M1 Pro, M1 Max, and M1 Ultra are still much more powerful. When I had the 2020 M1 MacBook Pro, the computer itself was just not powerful enough for me, but the M1 Pro processor is a lot quicker and this does the job perfectly. This laptop also comes with a standard 16GB of RAM, which I think is enough. Mine has an upgraded 1TB SSD from Apple, since it's easy for me to use over 512GB of storage, and I have the M1 Pro CPU. The M2 Pro processors will have a speed increase when they come out, but the MacBooks will probably stay the same design-wise with no more useful features added really. If there is an M2 Pro Mac Mini, I might buy it because I do want a desktop at some point. Using the MacBook Pro docked is easier than it sounds, as it's basically acting as a desktop when I connect my USB hub and my monitor and close the lid. The downside is that the device is always on the charge, and due to that my battery health has dropped without using the battery a lot. The mini LED display is still my favorite display technology. I really like the colors and the dimming zones, and it makes the laptop feel like a really nice OLED display. The notch is barely noticeable, and it's never been an interruption on this computer. I like the rounded corners on the display. They've never gotten in the way of anything. The display gets pretty bright, much brighter than my old Dell XPS that I tested for about a month, and also much brighter than any other Windows laptop I've tested. It's by far, I don't know if Windows just has terrible display drivers, or if Apple's displays are just so far ahead, but this display is just amazing. The keyboard is great, probably the best laptop keyboard I've used, but the paint tends to wear down quickly, causing a shininess effect on the keyboard, which I do not like. Some people don't like the removal of the touch bar, but I don't mind it at all, since 1, it was only usable when I'm using the laptop's built-in keyboard, and it didn't really give much functionality compared to just using hotkeys, and 3, it was overall just quite useless when compared to something from previous Macs like a function key row. I got used to the touch bar, but I'm glad they got rid of it. One thing I don't like is the full height function key row. I wish they were half height, like the prior to touch bar MacBook Pros. I also think the black backdrop on the keyboard looks kinda goofy, but I don't really use the internal keyboard as much as I use an external keyboard, so it doesn't really matter to me. This computer still holds up almost as well over a year later as it would when it came out. I updated it to macOS Ventura from macOS Monterey in November, and I think I should have stayed on Monterey, even though I can downgrade, because of the various changes, most notably to the Settings app with the stupid touch-based interface, and the new minimal changes that Apple's added with a lot of stability issues. The battery health on mine dropped to 99%, somewhere in around 20 charge cycles, but I've used it mostly on the charge connected to a monitor, so that's expected. The space gray paint finish has still held up pretty well. There's some scratching around the ports, though, of course. I put on a screen protector on the display from Spigen to reduce scratching from cleaning the display. I also put some palm rest covers on it because they were cheap and they looked pretty cool. I put a spec case on the computer when I bought it to prevent denting and scratching. I would use a keyboard cover to prevent key wear, but it makes the keyboard feel terrible, and it makes the whole computer look even dumber than I think it already does with all these weird accessories that I put on it. I want to buy a trackpad cover for like $10 just to put more stuff on the computer, because it already looks pretty weird with all this stuff on it, and I think it looks funny. I can still recommend people buy this computer since there's no telling when Apple will release the next generation of MacBook Pros. It could be soon or it could be late. I'd assume they'll probably come out with it around March or April of 2022, but I really don't know because everybody thought that they would update it in October, and it's January now almost. Whenever I use a normal M1 based Mac, I seem to run into issues. On paper, M1 is supposed to be very powerful, but whenever I use the M1 iMac in my living room, it's laggy, and since May, the Messages app hasn't worked at all. It just crashes upon opening it, and updates haven't fixed it. I also tried wiping all the messages manually from Finder. I also had an M1 MacBook Pro for a bit under a year, and that MacBook was pretty terrible to use. It was the base model with 8GB of RAM, and it was very slow, probably due to that, so I ended up switching back to Intel prior to the 2021 MacBook Pro's release, and it was a very good option on my end, because I ended up using that computer a lot more than I wanted to use the M1 MacBook Pro. Nowadays, I probably wouldn't want to go back to Intel, even though the app compatibility and the fact that you can run Windows on it is very convenient. It just doesn't make sense because they're pretty old now, with the newest Intel MacBook being almost 3 years old, I believe, since it came out in early 2020. And the last Intel MacBook Pro that was in a 16-inch form factor with a dedicated GPU was a 16-inch MacBook Pro from late 2019. And that computer I would probably not use either, even though it had an amazing design, because that computer is just pretty old now. I'm pretty sure it's running on like the 9th gen Intel processors, and I think that the 13th gen Intel processors are out now. This MacBook Pro is nearly perfect for me. There could be a few things I would want out of it, but in general, this MacBook Pro works fine, and I like using it. I don't know when I'll upgrade, but seeing as this is a first generation of a redesign, it probably won't be that soon, as this MacBook has a lot of usage left in it. If I was to upgrade to any other Mac, I would probably buy a M2 Pro Mac Mini if that comes out, or a Mac Studio. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed, a like would be appreciated, and if you want to see more content like this, you can subscribe. Goodbye.